Dying millionaire makes a desperate request for the nurse to pretend to be his daughter for one whole day. What happens next is surprising. Richard Bennett lay on his deathbed. The beams of light streaming through the hospital window seemed to dance across his aged face, revealing the marks of a life filled with achievements and regrets. He stared at the white ceiling where the fluorescent lights pulsed gently, mimicking the monotonous rhythm of his heart, echoing in sync with the monitors surrounding him. With each beat, memories of his life as a magnate flooded back, from successful negotiations to lavish parties, but above all, an absence filled his thoughts. His daughter, Alice. I let her slip away, he murmured to himself, his voice choked with fragility. Always so focused on work, and now it's too late. Tears formed in his eyes, but he brushed them away, as if the act of crying symbolized a weakness he could not afford. Memories of Alice, a giggling little girl running through the mansion's garden, overwhelmed his mind. He recalled the laughter, the playfulness, and how over the years their relationship deteriorated into a sea of misunderstandings and disappointments. At that moment, the door to his room opened, and Emily Harris entered, bringing with her a breath of fresh air. The young nurse, still in her 20s, had a contagious energy that seemed to contrast with the heavy atmosphere of the hospital. She wore a small smile, a simple gesture that lit up the gloomy room. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett. How are you feeling today?" she asked, her voice soft and comforting as she approached the bed. Richard watched her with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "I don't think there are many good days left for me, my dear. But if you are here, maybe my day has improved a bit," he replied, struggling to smile, although the gesture seemed weary. Emily adjusted her uniform and began checking the medical equipment around him, but her gaze never strayed far from Richard. "It's hard, isn't it? The loneliness that comes with age and illness," she said, sensing the sorrow that lingered in the air. "You don't know the half of it," he replied, his eyes misty. "I spent my whole life building an empire, but what have I really built?" He paused, his voice faltering. "I lost my daughter, and now I am alone." Emily felt a wave of empathy wash over her. Sometimes people drift apart because of misunderstandings. Sometimes it takes a gesture, a small sign that they still care, she suggested, trying to offer comfort. "I tried, but life consumed me. And now what can I do?" Richard looked at the nurse, his expression heavy with despair. "I need to see her again, but she doesn't want to see me. The pain is too much." "Then perhaps you should try another way. Sometimes an unexpected gesture can make all the difference," Emily replied, feeling more and more drawn into Richard's story. He stared at her, his eyes lighting up with an idea. "What do you think about pretending to be my daughter for a day? Just one day. I know it sounds insane, but I need her. I need one last act of redemption." The request took Emily by surprise, and she hesitated, biting her lower lip. "That's complicated, Mr. Bennett. I don't know if that's right. Please," he implored, his voice barely a whisper. "Just for a moment, so I can feel that she is here, so I can say goodbye as a father should." Emily looked directly into his eyes, feeling the depth of his pain. "I'll think about it," she finally said, her heart heavy. The idea intrigued and frightened her at the same time, but there was something in Richard's vulnerability that made her want to help. As she stepped away to prepare the medications, Richard lost himself in thought. There was a possibility of reconnecting, even if just for a brief moment, and who knows, it might bring a little peace to a man who, on his deathbed, only wished for one last glimpse of the love he once had. Emily Harris surveyed the dark and cold room where Richard Bennett lay. The silence was broken only by the soft sounds of the machines monitoring his vitality. The nurse, a young woman with brown hair and a kind gaze, felt a mix of compassion and sadness as she looked at the man who, despite his overwhelming success, seemed so vulnerable. As Richard battled against the loneliness that surrounded him, Emily could not help but reflect on her own experiences. The weight of life seemed to have accumulated on her shoulders, and her mind wandered back to a past where an absent father had left his marks. "You seem lost in thought, young lady," Richard said, his voice hoarse, breaking the silence. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, yet also recognized. "It's hard not to think about life, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," Emily replied, hesitating for a moment. "It's been a long day. I've been thinking about the choices we make and how they affect us." "Choices," Richard repeated, the word escaping as a whisper. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to retrieve memories long lost. "I've made many wrong choices, and now here I am, surrounded by what I've built, but without what truly matters. The nurse felt her heart tighten upon hearing those words. You're not alone. I know that. Perhaps it hasn't been easy for you and your daughter, but there's still time. Time. Richard let out a bitter laugh. Time is a thief. It takes everything, even the chances to mend what's broken. He looked at Emily, his eyes becoming more profound. Do you have someone you love? Emily thought of her troubled relationship with her father. Not in the way I would like. He passed away a few years ago. I left before we could reconcile. Richard observed her closely, as if he could see through her soul. You lost the chance to say goodbye. I lost that chance with my daughter, Alice. She distanced herself from me because of my choices. Now I wish she were here. It's understandable to feel that way, but you can still try to reconnect with her, Emily suggested, the idea beginning to take shape in her mind. Perhaps an honest conversation could help. You don't understand, Richard said, his voice trembling. She doesn't want to see me, and I don't know if she can forgive me. I made choices that I can't even describe. The life I built was more important to me than the relationship I had with her. Emily felt the weight of his pain in his words. You can take a step toward reconciliation, even if it's late. Sometimes a small action can change everything. She hesitated before asking, what would you like her to know? Richard took a deep breath, his eyes filling with tears. I wish she knew that I love her, that I have always loved her even when I was so busy, that I regret it, that I wish I had done things differently. Emily felt a spark of hope as she heard Richard's vulnerability. What do you think could help? Any way to connect with her? Richard looked at her with a glimmer of determination and vulnerability. I would like to have one last act of redemption, a chance to reconnect with her. But I need your help, Emily. I want you to pretend to be my daughter, Alice, for a day. The request caught her off guard. But sir, that's a lot. I can't just... Please, he interrupted, almost pleading. Just for one day, for me, so I can feel what I've lost, so I can find a little peace somehow. Emily hesitated, her heart racing at the gravity of the request. What if the real Alice shows up? What would I say to her? I don't know, Richard replied, a look of desperation on his face. But I'm willing to take that risk. I need to feel that there's still a little love between us, even if it's an illusion. The nurse looked at him, seeing the pain and sincerity in his eyes. What seemed like an impossible task was beginning to form in her mind. All right, I'll help. But we need a plan in case Alice shows up. I don't want to cause more pain. Richard smiled, a sad but genuine smile. Thank you, Emily. You have no idea how much this means to me. As the nurse stepped away to plan how she would impersonate Alice, a mix of fears and hopes began to take shape in her heart. The idea of becoming the bridge between a father and daughter so estranged felt like a monumental task, but perhaps it was also the chance they both needed to heal their wounds. In the quiet hospital room, the soft morning light filtered through the curtains, creating an atmosphere of melancholy and hope. Richard Bennett stared intently at Emily, who was now presenting herself as his daughter, Alice. The emotion in his eyes was undeniable. He felt a mix of joy and pain seeing the young woman who, for a day, would become the bridge to the love he had lost. Alice, he whispered, his voice choked. I can't believe you're here. Emily, dressed in a simple blouse that Richard had always imagined his daughter wearing, felt her heart race. The weight of the lie pressed down on her, but Richard's vulnerability enveloped her in a strange yet comforting way. I'm here, Dad. I'm here, she replied, trying to mimic the softness of Alice's voice. He hugged her tightly, as if fearing she would disappear the moment he let go. I miss you so much, he said, tears starting to roll down his face. I thought success would make me happy, but what I really wanted was to be with you. Emily looked back at him, the pain in her heart mingling with a deep empathy. You did what you thought was right, didn't you? To ensure I had everything I needed. Her voice trembled as she remembered her own troubled relationship with her father. But what you really wanted was your daughter's love, wasn't it? Richard nodded slowly, his eyes lost in memories. Yes, I worked so hard thinking that money and fame could make up for my absence. But that's not how it works. I lost you and I don't know how to fix it. As he spoke, Emily felt herself becoming more immersed in Richard's story. She remembered her own father who had left without a last word, leaving a void that was never filled. I never had the chance to say goodbye to my dad, she confessed, her voice low. He left, and I always wished I could understand what happened between us. Richard looked at her, the connection between them deepening. That's why I need you now, Alice, to understand what I did wrong so that I can at least try to redeem myself. I want to help, Dad, but you need to be honest with me. What really happened between us? Emily asked, her voice firm, yet full of understanding. He took a deep breath, the heavy memories weighing on his mind. I was so focused on building my empire that I didn't realize how far you were drifting away. Instead of being a father, I became a stranger, and now I deeply regret it. You can still change that, Richard, Emily said, using the name she knew was familiar but hesitated to use. There's still time to find a way back. But how? What can I do to earn your forgiveness? Richard pleaded, the vulnerability in his voice almost palpable. Emily hesitated, the line between her role as a nurse and that of a daughter blurring. Sometimes, all we need is to hear a word of love. A simple declaration can change everything. Richard looked deeply into her eyes, and in that moment, the room seemed to fill with a new energy. Alice, I love you. I have always loved you. I just didn't know how to show it. I've been so lost. That's a good start, Dad, Emily replied, feeling the weight of the lie dissolve as the truth became more evident. I want you to know that we all make mistakes. What matters is how we deal with them. The connection between them strengthened, and despite the falsehood hovering over the situation, Richard's sincere words brought a new breath of life to the atmosphere. If you truly love me, let's allow ourselves a new beginning. You already have the chance to change things with Alice. This is your opportunity, she said, trying to instill hope in an uncertain future. He smiled, his expression transforming from pain to a faint glimmer of hope. Thank you, Alice. Thank you for giving me this chance. I promise I will do my best to mend our ties. As they talked, a sense of peace began to envelop the room, as if everything that was broken could somehow be restored. The conversation flowed, and the weight of sadness seemed to dissipate, giving way to a new understanding that, while fragile, was a step towards healing. Alice Bennett was back in the town she once called home, yet it now felt so distant and strange. The sun hid behind gray clouds, mirroring her emotional state as she drove towards the hospital. The news of her father Richard Bennett's critical condition hit her like a bolt of lightning. Even though the years of distance and resentment had built a wall between them, the thought of losing her father made her stop and reflect on everything that had happened. Memories of her childhood flooded her mind, like flashes of a past she tried to forget. How could he be like this? After everything, she thought, tears filling her eyes. He had every opportunity in the world and still chose to distance himself from me. Amid the turmoil of her feelings, Alice remembered the happy moments, the laughter, the stories told before bed, the dreams shared. But all of this was overshadowed by the pain and disappointment that followed. Upon arriving at the hospital, a wave of anxiety washed over her. With hesitant steps, she walked through the cold white corridors, smelling the antiseptic that permeated the air. The elevator took her to the floor where her father was hospitalized. Her heart raced uncontrollably and her breathing grew heavier with each step. As she approached the door to the room, she hesitated, a whirlwind of emotions consuming her. Come on, Alice. You need to do this, she told herself, trying to find her courage. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and walked in. What she found left her paralyzed. In the bed, her father was surrounded by medical equipment, but what shocked her most was the figure of a young nurse wearing her clothes. The nurse looked at her with a surprised expression, and Alice immediately felt that something was wrong. Who are you? Alice demanded, her tone heavy with confusion and indignation. What are you doing here? I'm Nurse Emily. I'm taking care of your father, the young woman replied, her voice trembling as she glanced at Richard, who appeared to be in a state of drowsiness but wore a slight smile as he looked at Emily. This doesn't make sense. Why are you dressed like me? Alice pressed on, her gaze fixed on the nurse. Her emotions were close to boiling over, and she didn't know if she felt more scared or angry. Richard, sensing the tense atmosphere, tried to intervene. Alice, please. It's a long story. I asked Emily to impersonate you for a day. You asked what? The shock in Alice's voice echoed through the room. You can't be serious. Please listen to me, Richard pleaded, his eyes darting between the two women. I need a chance to reconnect with you. Life is short, and I've made so many mistakes. Alice felt a surge of anger and sadness. Mistakes? You distanced yourself from me. You left me all alone. She looked at the nurse, who now appeared just as out of place as she felt. And you? Why are you doing this? Can't you see it's a lie? Emily, feeling the weight of Alice's words, tried to explain. "I just wanted to help, Alice. Your father is in a very difficult situation and he was feeling lonely. I wanted him to have a moment of happiness." "Happiness? You think this is happiness? He needs me, not a stranger pretending to be me." Alice was on the verge of tears, her vulnerability laid bare. Richard, in his frailty, made an effort to sit up. "Alice, please try to understand. I just wanted one moment with you before it was too late. I'm not perfect and I know I messed up, but I'm here, and I want to make things right." A heavy silence hung in the air. Alice looked at her father, lying on his deathbed, and then at the nurse, who seemed genuinely concerned. The situation was surreal, but there was something deeper at play. She felt the pain of her father and at the same time her own, intertwined in a labyrinth of feelings. As Alice entered the hospital room with her heart racing and her mind a storm of emotions, seeing her frail father and the young nurse dressed like her made her stomach churn. The initial shock took over, and amidst a mix of anger and confusion, her words came out like a scream. "What is happening here?" Emily, almost as shocked as Alice, hesitated. She didn't want to cause more pain, but the situation was more complex than it appeared. I'm Nurse Emily," she stammered, trying to explain, but Alice wasn't willing to listen. "And why are you pretending to be me? This is disrespectful." Alice shot back, her eyes blazing. Her tone was cutting, and Richard, trying to process the scene before him, quickly intervened. "Alice, wait. This isn't what it seems," he said, his voice trembling. "I asked Emily to impersonate you. I just wanted one last moment with you, to try to fix things between us." "Fix things?" Alice laughed, a bitter laugh that echoed through the room. "Do you think this can be repaired with a charade? After all these years of silence and abandonment, you think putting a stranger in your life will make everything go back to how it was?" Richard looked at his daughter, the pain in his eyes reflecting the gravity of his condition. "It wasn't a charade, Alice. I just didn't know how to reconnect with you. I've wasted so much time," he confessed. "I wanted you to be here, and the only way I could think of was this. You don't understand, do you?" Alice was becoming increasingly agitated. "You distanced yourself from me. I pulled away because I didn't want to be like you, Richard. I didn't want to live behind a facade, fighting for money and prestige while the people we love are put second." Richard felt the weight of her words, as if each one were an arrow piercing his heart. "I knew I should have done more, should have supported you, but I was so focused on my career. I saw you drifting away and didn't know how to stop it. I thought if I succeeded you would be proud of me," he said, his voice choked. Alice crossed her arms, anger mingling with sadness. "You don't realize that your success means nothing to me? I just wanted your love, your support, but you were always gone, too busy to notice that I was hurting. And now, instead of apologizing, you bring a stranger to impersonate me. Is that what you consider a solution?" Emily, listening to the intense exchange, felt her own guilt intensifying. She didn't want to be the center of discord, but she also knew her presence had made an impact. "Alice, I didn't want to be an intruder. I just wanted to help Richard connect with you, to understand the pain he felt from your absence," she said, trying to ease the tension. "You don't understand anything," Alice shot back, turning to Emily. "You may have good intentions, but you don't know what it's like to live in the shadow of someone who was never present. You can't just put on a mask and expect everything to be resolved." Richard, realizing the conversation was spiraling out of control, decided it was time to be honest. "Alice, I never wanted you to follow in my footsteps. I wanted you to be free, but I failed to support you in your choice. I didn't know how to handle it. My fear of losing you made me act selfishly," he admitted, tears in his eyes. Alice stopped, her gaze fixed on her father. "You left me with no choice, Dad. I didn't want to be an extension of you or your ambitions. I wanted to be myself, but you pushed me away, and now all that's left is this pain," she replied, her voice choked, but no less intense. In that moment, silence filled the room, as the three of them reflected on what had been said. The atmosphere was charged with emotions, and each of them struggled to find a way toward understanding and healing. The tension in the air was palpable as they stared at each other, each carrying their own wounds and regrets. The silence that followed Alice's emotional outburst was heavy, as if time had stopped. Emily felt her heart race, guilt consuming her for being there, dressed as the daughter that Richard so desperately wanted to see, yet knowing that she was far from it. I didn't want this to happen," Emily began, her voice trembling. I just wanted to help." Richard, still trying to catch his breath after the intense discussion, looked at Emily with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "You're not to blame, my dear. I am responsible for all of this. My ambition and selfishness drove me away from Alice." He turned to his daughter, his gaze now filled with regret. "Forgive me, Alice. I never wanted you to feel this way." Alice, tears in her eyes, shook her head, her anger slowly dissipating in the face of her father's vulnerability. "You were always so focused on your work, Dad. I wanted to be a part of your life, but you never seemed to care." Her voice was a mix of pain and longing, memories of a childhood in which she yearned for her father's attention flooding her mind. Emily watched the conversation unfold, feeling like a witness to a deeply intimate moment. "I understand a bit about this," she said, interrupting the cycle of pain. "My father passed away when I was young. I never got the chance to say goodbye. I always wished for one last conversation, something that would bring us together again." "Do you think that justifies what you did?" Alice shot back, her voice rising. "You pretended to be me. That's not right, Emily." "I know," Emily replied, holding Alice's hand in a gesture of empathy. "But for a brief moment I saw your father's pain, and I didn't want him to die without having a chance to make amends. Sometimes people do unimaginable things when they are desperate." Richard, listening to the two women, felt an overwhelming wave of emotion flood his heart. "If I had known that my pursuit of success would cost me my family, I would never have gone down that path." He took a deep breath, the words heavy in his throat. "I wanted you to have freedom, Alice, but I lost myself in the process. I didn't realize that your freedom also meant being away from me." Alice looked at her father, her heart warming slightly at the sincerity of his words. "I always wanted to carve my own path, Dad, but I also wanted you to be there. There was no room for both of us, and that broke me." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, taking a deep breath. "I don't want to carry this pain anymore. I want to understand you, but that means we need to be honest with each other." Emily, feeling the intensity of the moment, decided to share her own pain. "The loss of my father shaped me. I became a nurse because I wanted to connect with people, help those who, like me, didn't have the chance to say goodbye. What happened here today makes me realize that even in the worst circumstances, human connections are what truly matter." Richard looked at Emily with admiration. "You're a beautiful soul, Emily. Even without knowing it, you brought light to this dark room." He then turned to Alice, his eyes filled with tears. "I want you to know that I am willing to fight for you, for our relationship. I want to make amends, not just for myself, but for us." Alice, sensing the sincerity in his eyes, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "If you're truly willing to try, so am I. But we need to be honest and straightforward with each other. No more lies." "Yes," Richard agreed, his voice now stronger. "I'm ready to face all of this, just give me a chance." The atmosphere, once charged with tension and anger, was beginning to transform into a space of hope and reconciliation. The pain of the past was still present, but for the first time there was a glimpse of a future where understanding and forgiveness could flourish, even amidst the chaos of life. Alice looked at her father with a mix of anger and confusion. The words he had just spoken echoed in her mind, and the pain of years of hurt seemed to manifest as a knot in her throat. "How could you do this, Dad? How can you just apologize now when it's too late?" she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Richard, with misty eyes, took a deep breath. "Alice, I know I can't erase the past, but I want you to understand that I never wanted you to feel this way. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I was so focused on building my empire that I didn't see what I was destroying around me." He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather courage. "I wanted you to be free, to not have to carry the weight of my expectations." "Freedom? Is that what you call freedom?" Alice shot back, her expression hardening. "I felt abandoned, Dad. You were so busy trying to be a magnate that you didn't realize you were losing your daughter. I just wanted a father around, someone who cared, who had time for me. And when I finally decided to follow my own path, you ignored me." Emily, who had been silent until then, felt the tension in the air rise. She looked at Richard, who seemed to crumble under the weight of his daughter's words. Remembering her own complicated relationship with her father, she decided to intervene. "Alice, I understand how you feel. I also lost the chance to say goodbye to my father. Sometimes pain makes us make hasty decisions." Alice turned to Emily, confused. "And who are you to talk about this? You don't know my family's story. You don't know how much this hurts." Richard interrupted, his voice now more assertive, though still trembling. "But she's right, Alice. No one knows the pain they haven't lived, and maybe for a moment we can share each other's pain, and that might help us heal. Alice hesitated, observing the connection between the two. The fact that Richard was opening up to Emily in a way he had never done with her left her perplexed. "You never even gave me a chance to understand your pain, Dad. What did you expect me to do? So I should just wait for you to come back to me while you were busy building your fortune?" Richard lowered his head, feeling the weight of his choices. "I expected nothing, Alice. I just hoped you knew that behind it all I loved you. Sometimes love manifests in strange ways. I wanted to protect you, but instead, I lost you." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Alice looked at Emily, who was now by her side, and realized there was a connection between them, a shared understanding of loss and regret. "And you, Emily, what do you think I should do? Forgive him? How can I do that after everything?" "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting," Emily replied softly, looking into Alice's eyes. "It's an act of liberation, for you and for him. I'm not here to tell you what to do, but understand that we all make mistakes. Sometimes people get lost, but that doesn't mean they can't find their way back to each other." Alice took a deep breath, absorbing Emily's words. Something inside her began to change. "Maybe I've held on to this anger for too long, but it's not easy, you know? It's not easy to forget what I felt growing up without my father." Richard, sensing the change in the air, reached out his hand to Alice. "I want you to know that I'm here, ready to listen to everything you have to say. I'm not asking for forgiveness right now, but for a chance to start over, even if that means just a small step." Alice hesitated, but the sincerity in Richard's gaze was something she couldn't ignore. A small step. Maybe that's all we can do right now. She looked at Emily, who offered her an encouraging smile, and for a moment, amidst all the pain, there was a glimmer of hope that forgiveness could be possible. Richard looked at Alice with a spark of hope in his eyes, a light he hadn't felt in a long time. The air in the hospital room, once heavy with regret, now felt lighter, almost vibrant. He knew this was a symbolic moment, a gesture that could signify a new beginning, even as he stood on the brink of his end. "Can we share one last meal together?" he asked, his voice choked but full of emotion. Alice hesitated, the weight of the question hanging between them. "A meal? Here?" she inquired, incredulity evident in her tone. There was something surreal about the idea, as if they were allowing themselves a fragment of normalcy amidst the chaos. "Yes," Richard replied, almost smiling. "Remember the soup I used to make? The one you always said was the best in the world?" The memory brought a slight smile to Alice's lips, and for a brief moment, the barriers she had built seemed to crumble. I remember," Alice responded, her voice soft. "It was onion soup with melted cheese." She closed her eyes for a moment, reliving those childhood days when meals were moments of joy and togetherness. "But I don't know if I can do that now." "I know you can," Richard insisted with a determination that barely disguised the tremor in his voice. "You've always been great in the kitchen, and if it doesn't work out, we can order something. What matters is that we're together, right?" Alice pondered for a moment. She looked at Emily, who was watching the scene with a mix of apprehension and hope. The nurse gave her a small nod, as if encouraging her to move forward. Alice took a deep breath, feeling torn, but something inside her sparked. "Okay," she said resolutely. "I'll do it." Richard smiled, and the expression on his face was one of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, Alice. This means more to me than you can imagine." He settled back into his bed, trying to find a comfortable position, as his daughter stood to leave the room. "I'll go get the ingredients and be right back," Alice announced, hurrying out. As she walked through the hospital corridors, her mind was filled with memories and conflicting feelings. She needed time to reconnect with her father, and perhaps rediscover a little bit of herself in the process. When she returned, she brought a small paper bag filled with fresh ingredients and spices. "Here it is," Alice said, placing the bag on the bedside table. "I hope you still like soup. Just knowing you're making this is a gift," Richard replied, his eyes shining. He watched as she began to prepare the soup, stirring the ingredients carefully, as if assembling an emotional puzzle. "Do you remember how I used to make it? Always adding a little cheese on top?" Alice asked, trying to keep the conversation light, but the emotion was seeping into her voice. "Of course. And you always said that was the best part." Richard laughed, a sound that was music to Alice's ears. "You also always thought the soup tasted better when I made it with love. And you never forgot to add a pinch of care, did you?" Alice replied, a smile playing on her lips. The atmosphere in the room was slowly changing, the walls laden with pain and resentment beginning to fade away. As the soup started to boil, the aroma began to fill the space, bringing forth memories of a lighter time. Richard closed his eyes, soaking in the smell that transported him back home, to the warmth of family meals where laughter and love intertwined. "You know, I always wanted you to follow your dreams, Alice," Richard commented, breaking the silence that hung in the air. "But I got caught up in my own ambition and lost focus on what really mattered." Alice looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "And I got lost in the pain, Dad. But today, here, I feel like we can start over." Once the soup was ready, Alice served a portion on a plate and handed it to Richard. "Here's your soup, made with love and a bit of cheese." Richard held the plate with trembling hands and a smile spread across his face. "You have no idea how much this means to me, Alice." The atmosphere, once somber, now brightened with laughter and cherished memories. In that moment, the bond between father and daughter was strengthening, creating a new chapter unfolding before them, a sign that love and reconciliation were still possible, even in the most challenging circumstances. However, the ambiance of the hospital room, which had been filled with laughter and shared memories, was about to be abruptly altered. Richard, with an animated expression as he reminisced about Alice's childhood days, suddenly began to feel pressure in his chest. A faint sigh escaped his lips, and in an instant, his face contorted in pain. The conversation, which had once flowed like a calm river, became tense and unsettling. "Dad, are you okay?" Alice asked, concern seeping into her voice. She leaned forward, her hand outstretched toward her father, seeking a connection that felt so necessary in that moment. The expression in Richard's eyes, once bright with joy, was now filled with despair. I'm just a bit tired," he replied, but the tremor in his voice convinced no one. Emily, who was watching the scene with keen attention, immediately stood up, ready to help. Her training as a nurse had taught her to recognize the signs of an impending collapse. "Richard, no, this doesn't just seem like tiredness. You need help," Emily declared, her voice firm and resolute. She moved closer to the bed, pressing the emergency button. Alice looked at Emily, her eyes widening in alarm. "What's happening? He can't... Not now." The anguish was evident in her words. The rising desperation made Alice's heart race, and the feeling of reconnection that had begun to blossom between her and Richard seemed to fade amid the uncertainty. Seconds dragged on as the medical team arrived quickly, rushing down the hall, their firm and decisive footsteps echoing against the hospitals. "What do we have here?" A doctor entered, quickly assessing the situation. Richard tried to speak, but his breathing was labored, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on his chest. "He was fine just a moment ago," Alice exclaimed, her eyes brimming with tears as she watched the doctor surround her father. "What's happening to him?" Her voice trembled, and she wanted to believe that everything would be okay. "We need to monitor his vital signs." "Richard, can you hear me? Try to breathe slowly," said the doctor, adjusting the monitors around the bed and placing an oximeter on his finger. Richard closed his eyes, trying to focus on the doctor's words, but the pressure in his chest seemed to increase. He murmured with difficulty, "I'm sorry. I just wanted to spend more time with you." It was a whisper, but in such a critical moment, it resonated like a scream in the silence of the room. Emily, who was beside Alice, held her hand. "Come on, we need to be strong now. He needs us," she said, the determination in her voice trying to calm the emotional storm that was brewing. Alice nodded, a mix of fear and hope reflected in her gaze. "I'm here, Dad, I'm here," Alice said, her voice breaking. "Don't worry, we will get through this together." She leaned closer to her father, trying to touch him in a way that would make him feel her presence even amid the chaos. Richard, struggling, opened his eyes and found his daughter's loving gaze. "Alice, he began, but a new coughing fit interrupted him. The doctor immediately turned to him, adjusting his head and checking his pulse. Her face worried, yet professional. "We're here, Dad. Stay with me," Alice whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held Richard's hand. The air in the room felt heavy, as if the outside world had vanished, leaving only the three of them in a space of vulnerability and connection. Then, amid the turmoil, Richard managed, with a colossal effort, to whisper, "I love you, Alice." The declaration, though weak, carried immeasurable weight, and the sincerity of his words traversed the space between them. Alice could not hold back her tears. "I love you too, Dad. I've always loved you," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. The moment, despite the crisis, was imbued with an emotional intensity that transcended fear and uncertainty. Alice and Emily, united in concern, became a source of support for one another, while Richard, surrounded by their love, fought to remain present. Richard was in critical condition. The light in the hospital room flickered, reflecting the worry etched on Alice and Emily's faces as they stood by his side. Alice's heart raced when the doctor entered, his expression carrying a mix of urgency and hope. He approached the bed, his eyes fixed on Richard, who was pale and gasping for breath. "Mr. Bennett, we have a new possibility for you. A compatible organ donor has come forward," the doctor said, his voice firm but gentle. "She is a woman you met years ago. With the right treatment, you could have a real chance at recovery." Alice froze for a moment, confused by the revelation. "A donor?" she asked, looking at the doctor. "Who is this woman? How do you know this?" The doctor took a deep breath, sensing the intensity of the situation. "She recently volunteered for donation in a transplant program. After a series of tests, we discovered she is a match for your father. Her information was cross-referenced, and, well, the connection is surprising." Richard, even in his weakened state, lifted his head slightly, a spark of interest crossing his eyes. "Who is she?" I can't remember anyone that... It's a woman named Sarah. She worked with you many years ago on a sustainability project. You met her at a conference," the doctor clarified, maintaining a calm and controlled tone. "She was inspired by your vision and decided to become a donor after a personal experience." Alice felt a wave of mixed emotions. You really don't remember her?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "She could be your chance to live, Dad." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to piece together a distant memory. "Sarah," he murmured as a look of recognition began to appear on his face. "She had an incredible passion. I had so much to learn from her." "That's it. You can have a new chance, Dad," Alice exclaimed, hope starting to fill her heart. "You need to fight for this, for us." "Yes, for us," Emily added, her voice soft yet filled with determination. "You can recover and make amends with your life, with Alice." Richard looked at the two women by his side, feeling the weight of their words. I don't know if I deserve this second chance," he said, his voice trembling. "So many things I've done, so many lost opportunities. You deserve it, Dad." "We all deserve a second chance," Alice replied, her eyes shining with tears. "You have the opportunity to right your wrongs, and I'm here, ready to support you." The doctor, sensing that emotions were overtaking the conversation, decided to intervene. "We need to act quickly. If you accept, we can start the preparation process for the transplant. This could change everything, Richard." Richard felt the pressure of his words. He looked at Alice, who was watching him with a mix of hope and fear. "You'll be by my side, won't you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Of course I will, Dad. I'll always be here," Alice affirmed, gripping his hand tightly. "And I will too," Emily added with an encouraging smile. "You're not alone in this." Richard took a deep breath, feeling determination swell within him. "Then let's do this. I'm going to fight for this chance. For you both." The doctor took some notes and began explaining the next steps, but Richard was lost in his own thoughts. The revelation of the donor not only brought a possibility of life, but also a new moral dilemma. He should focus on recovering his health, but at the same time, he was faced with the reality of his relationships. "I have to think about Sarah and what I left behind," Richard murmured, his gaze distant. "She deserves to know that I'm sorry for not valuing the people around me." Alice, touched by her father's vulnerability, smiled, seeing in him a man finally willing to confront his weaknesses. "And that's why you're going to fight, not just to save yourself, but to make amends with those you love." The room, once filled with shadows and regrets, now shone with a new light. Richard, Alice, and Emily were united by a renewed hope, ready to face whatever lay ahead, together.